Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program Seminar Series podcast at the Harvard Kennedy School.
I am going to go ahead and start us, even though I know there are a few people still grabbing their lunch. My name is Hannah Riley Bowles, and I'm before you as a research director at the Women in Public Policy Program, where here we are dedicated to closing gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, health, and education. Very ambitious agenda. Part of that is through supporting and disseminating and creating conversation around academic research related to gender. And so this seminar is part of that mission. Now, while we're sitting together in a relatively small seminar room, I want you to imagine thousands of other podcasters also joining us in the room, or not podcasters, I guess podcast consumers. Our seminars have been downloaded now over 11,000 times. So in the interest of thinking, particularly in the interest of thinking about our broader community of listeners, what we ask is for people to make sure they've turned off their cell phones, and that when they ask questions, that they're genuinely questions, and that they relate to the subject of the presentation, which is we don't have much trouble with those constraints. All right, wonderful. Now I am so especially delighted to be introducing Lakshmi Ramarajan today, who is a professor at the Harvard Business School. Lakshmi is very much a friend of the Women in Public Policy Program and many of us. I'm gonna ditch your formal invitation. I just want to highlight a couple things about Lakshmi. One, before entering academia, Lakshmi was very much a kindred spirit of many of our Kennedy School community. She actually worked in international development in West Africa and on conflict-related issues, and then was recruited into academia. And within academia, she's been one of really the leading thinkers around intersectionality, which is really a space where I think in some ways our students are ahead of us as faculty in terms of their lived experience or self-identity. And Lakshmi has been one of the people who's sort of getting beyond just saying, oh, you're a woman and you're black or something like that. She's actually been one of the first people to get people thinking much more broadly about the many identities that are salient for them at various points in time, and how people use those multiple identities to motivate themselves at work and through other endeavors. And I'm just gonna really honored to have you here, Lakshmi, and she is going to present some of her work right now on blurring the boundaries.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was a very nice introduction. And in fact, you stole my opening line.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Which basically was that I'm super excited to be here because I've long followed the stuff that you guys have been doing here at the Kennedy School with the Women in Public Policy Program. And share this work with you. This work is a collaboration with Stefan Dimitriadis, who is right here. He's an awesome graduate student in our OB and Soc program, who's the first author on this paper, and Julie Battilana, who is also here, who, as you guys know, shares half of her mental, emotional, and intellectual energy with you at HKS and the business schools. And Matt Lee, who cannot be here in person, obviously, but is joining us in spirit. He's at INSEAD in Singapore. And so as Hannah just mentioned, I study multiple identities. So basically, how do people identify themselves with many different social roles and groups simultaneously, and how does this impact consequences we think are important for organizations? And I focus particularly on gender in some of my work because this is a primary way in which people identify themselves, but also in which they're identified by others. So this paper is intellectually interesting to me because it's about gender and this interplay between social and commercial sectors. But as Hannah alluded to, it's also personally extremely motivating to me because I really felt when I was working, when Julie and Matt and Stefan were talking about this paper, like there was something about it that personally resonated in this, my own journey from international NGOs and development work and living in this nonprofit world to, wait a second, you go to a business school, which is where I did my PhD and now where I work, and just the completely different mental models that people use. And so it's a relationship that maybe I over-identified with at times. So here we go. So let's start with the basics. What do we mean by this blurring of the boundaries between the social and commercial sectors that we allude to in the beginning? So as we know, the social and commercial sectors have been distinct for quite a few years, since their inception, essentially. People have talked about the goals, the values, the ideals that motivate social sector workers and organizations around issues and ideals such as social welfare, voluntarism, communalism. And the commercial sector holds a very distinct set of values and motives, such as profit maximization, efficiency, competition. These are goals that people are supposed to pursue and want to pursue when they move into these organizations. But over the last 30 or so years, the boundaries between these different sectors have started to blur, such that, for example, people use commercial practices in social sector organizations. They hire professionals coming out of business schools to run their organizations. They use marketing and accounting practices that you would commonly see in commercial sector organizations. And what this has meant is that if you are now an organization, a new organization in the social sector, you actually have some choices to make. So if you think just about the coexistence, you have to manage these tensions between the coexistence of these two different sets of goals as well as the practices in your organization that they represent. And today we're going to be talking specifically about practices related to how do you generate revenue for your organization. So in the social sector, traditionally, the revenue generating model is charity. You raise funds through donations, through grants. Many of us have lived this life and the difficulties that it involves. In the commercial sector, you often use, providing services and products that you charge people for and you earn revenue. So as a new organization in the social sector, this choice you have, you can either use typical models of funding and organize yourself around raising money through charity and donations, or you can actually choose to use this fairly different type of commercial practice that has been entering the field. And this is what we dive into. But what's really interesting and surprising about much of the research that's looked at this particular kind of choice that organizations make is that they've often pointed to environmental factors. So why do organizations in the social sector go towards these new models? Well, maybe it's perhaps because government funding has dried up, there are environmental shocks to the system, things like that. But no one has really used a gender lens to sort of understand this question. And yet, what is very apparent to us, and might be quite apparent to you since you're all people in this room who think about gender, is that if you think about the goals, values, and types of work that are represented by these two sectors, they're quite clearly gendered, right? So the values and norms that are supposed to motivate social sector organizations are very highly identified with feminine types of work, so caring, selflessness, communalism, and these commercial sector practices can be really overlaid with this masculine type of work, so risk-taking, competitiveness, and agentic work. And so our question is basically, how do you understand the locus of these tensions between the blurring of the boundaries of social and commercial sector with a gender lens that says that these tensions actually represent underlying tensions between masculine and feminine types of work and practices. And to do this, we actually take a gendered perspective in two ways. So our basic question is now, if you think about this underlying gender dynamic, what does the new social venture actually, how does it organize itself around these new revenue models? And we take this gender lens, particularly borrowing from Ridgway and others, where we think about gender not as an individual property or characteristic, but rather a system of widely held cultural beliefs that are activated in particular social relational contexts, right? And we think about these contexts in two ways. The first context we consider is if you just think that the social sector is feminine typed work, and in this feminine context, the use of commercial activity then represents this encroachment or introduction of a more masculine typed activity. And we ask, to what extent do female social venture founders use commercial activities when they found new social sector organizations? And then we also think about the context of the commercial sector, and we suggest that perhaps to what extent does feminine representation in the commercial sector around commercial practices then perhaps affect the use of commercial activity in the social sector? So what we're thinking about are actually two basic research questions. If you're the founder of the social venture, to what extent do female social venture founders in a feminine type sector actually engage in this masculine typed activity? And then how might the proportion of women who engage in this commercial masculine typed activity in the commercial sector influence this underlying dynamic? So our model is, all right, so let me first walk you through our two core hypotheses, and then I'll explain what the overall model looks like in the data. I'm flying through stuff, so please feel free to stop me and interrupt if you have questions or clarifications. I want to leave enough room for discussion as well at the end. So our first core hypothesis, why would we imagine that female social venture founders might actually be less inclined to engage in commercial practices within their organizations? So just from a straightforward perspective, you might say, well, this is not really a novel hypothesis, right? What we'd expect to see. But what I want to point out is, in fact, much of the research that we have, and actually Hannah and I were talking about this last week in another seminar, much of the work we have is around women engaging in masculine-typed practices in highly masculine contexts. And so it's not clear automatically on the surface that you should expect to see the same kind of dynamic. However, the little research we do have that we draw on suggests that, in fact, maybe they would be even more motivated to not engage in commercial practices in their organizations for a couple of reasons, even within a feminine-type sector where you might think they might have a greater sense of flexibility. The first is that, in fact, we know a little bit from the backlash research that when women engage in masculine-typed activity in feminine settings, that backlash is even more likely to be amplified because it's a greater violation of norms. And so you might expect that, in fact, women are still, even in this setting, less likely to do so. The second reason that we the underlying reason that we propose is that in the social sector, you might also imagine that charity-driven revenue practices are not just the norm, but they're held up as somewhat of an ideal, right? And so to that extent, workers in that sector would be more likely to identify with and perhaps even defend those practices against what they see as different. And so for those couple of reasons, we suggest that female social venture founders, even when they're founding organizations in the social sector, women are less likely to use commercial activity in their social ventures than male founders. The second hypothesis adds a bit more nuance and complication to this underlying story. We look at local communities. Now, why do we think about local communities? For a couple of reasons. First, we have some research that suggests that local communities are actually where the social and commercial sectors interact, right? So individuals and organizations from both sectors come together in often local community forums. So you can think about, the movement for a better Detroit, that has been going on for the last, decade, where, you get organizations that are committed to a particular community to come together from different sectors. The second reason for social venture founders in particular, local communities are where beneficiaries and sources of funding are often located. And within local communities, we suggest that female business owners might actually have an influence on female social venture founders' engagement in commercial practices. Now, why do we think this is interesting? This is an interesting subset of people in the community to look at, because these are women who are engaging in commercial activity, right? And so you might expect that these are women engaging in commercial activity exactly situated at this boundary between the social and commercial sectors, and so they might have some sort of an impact on cultural beliefs related to women engaging in commercial practices, such that these female social venture founders might self-stereotype less, they might fear or actually face backlash less, and may not identify as much or put as much of themselves into identifying with the charity model, and see that these other models are available. So our second hypothesis is essentially a moderating hypothesis. Female social venture founders in communities where there is a higher proportion of business owners who are female are more likely to use commercial activity in their social ventures than women in other communities. So it's a very basic model, but we think this is fairly novel and interesting for the reasons that I was just explaining. The first is a main effect, whether male or female social venture founders and the likelihood of using commercial activity. And the second is this moderating or interaction effect, that the percentage of female business owners in a community should actually should mitigate this effect. I'm actually going to walk you through two sets of data, but maybe this is a good time to pause and ask if there are any questions or thoughts for discussion, clarifications. Yeah?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, are we assuming here that the use of commercial activity is like a necessarily good thing?
That's a wonderful question. No, we are not assuming that. We are actually going to bring that question up for you at the very end as part of our discussion. Yeah, so this is just, do they engage in it or not? And you can imagine that there is there is actually in the, both in the literature and in practice, a big debate about whether we would want this or not.
Yeah, I'm curious about how churches fit into your model, because when you have caring and communal and all that seems to me to be very much in line with the church. which is frequently very male dominated?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. We don't actually consider this in our, sort of main models, but we do account for religious practices and religious communities, and you'll see that in some of our robustness checks. But I think it was a question that we definitely thought about in terms of what these communities look like and represent.
I'm just wondering, where does social venture founders come from?
Yeah.
Is there a difference by gender or?
Meaning, so walk me through what your expectation is.
If they have previous career experience or so what are their backgrounds going in?
Yeah, but you're saying, are they likely to be more
Yeah.
represented, meaning, or do you think women are more likely to be social venture
Well,
founders?
so the women go up through the ladder in
Yeah.
NGOs or something like this, whereas men come from the commercial sector,
Right.
or I don't know, I just
Right.
don't know anything about it, yeah.
So, from an empirical standpoint, here we're only looking at people who've already decided that they are going to start a social venture, and then we're looking at the sort of consequences for organizing your new venture in a particular fashion. But I think in terms of what leads to it, so we do control for things like, have you had any exposure to a business school, for example, or your undergraduate education, things like that. We also look at and I think maybe that might be a question that either Julie or Matt might, Julie or Stefan might be more likely to answer, if there's anything more on that we want to say.
I think it's when you get to the sample and you get to talk about it, maybe you can sort of take all the
Take it
questions,
there.
but the beauty of it is that we have the replication, so any of the questions we may have about the population we have in the first sample, we're
We
hopefully
can go
addressing
into.
all that with the second population.
Yeah.
Did you include anything about board composition of these ventures? Either the composition, the gender composition of the board, or other characteristics?
We do have some robustness checks that look at what their teams were like, and also in the second sample you'll see that we're getting there. But it sounds like all these questions are about the empiric, so why don't I just keep going there, and then we'll have more of this at the end. This is great. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through two different data sets, and the first is sort of the main sample where we tested our hypotheses, and the second is a constructive replication, and I'll tell you a little bit about each one as we go through it. The first is actually very unique, and kudos to Julie and Matt in particular for putting a ton of effort into collecting one of the first large data sets, over hundreds of observations over time on social ventures. This is a unique random sample of all applications to a prominent fellowship program for early stage social ventures. We take ventures that applied in the years 2007 and 2008. And so these are ventures that are less than 2 years old at the time that they apply. And so while there might be self-selection from a male or female perspective into do you decide to found or not, once we get here, we're sort of looking at the entire set of people who decide to apply for this fellowship program. We have 584 ventures in the sample, and they are in 104 communities across the U.S. So our dependent variable, the use of commercial activities in your venture, is a 1 to 5. Coded 1 to 5, where 1 is purely non-commercial sources of funding. So this is the typical charity model that you'd expect a social sector organization to take on, all the way to 5, where they say in their applications that we are going to use purely commercial sources of funding. These are open-ended text, boxes and answers from application essays that we had coded by independent raters who showed a very high degree of reliability and went through a very long and rigorous coding process. Happy to talk to you about that later offline if you want. The independent variables, the gender of the founder is coded from the application essay as well. 1 is if you're female. And the proportion of female business owners in the local geographic community, this was constructed in 2 steps. So first, ventures were matched to the core-based statistical area. This is basically a large metropolitan area. And this is a commonly used technique to study communities in the organizational field. And then to that, we then looked at the U.S. Census Bureau's data on the survey of business owners from the year 2007, which is when our data are from, and this tells you sort of the percentage of women in that local community that are business owners. We had a variety of control variables. You won't see them in the actual models, but I'm happy to share the paper just because of cluttering up the screen. But basically the community level characteristics that we controlled for included funding environment, as prior research would suggest, population, per capita income, a variety of things like that. At the project level, characteristics included, were you in health versus education versus something else? And at the founder level, we controlled for things like work experience, education, race. All right, so what do we see? So this is a mixed effects ordinal logit, which essentially takes care of or accounts for the fact that we have multiple observations within a single community. So the errors are correlated for.
I'm so sorry,
Yes.
can I interrupt just because it is relevant to
Yes.
the questions that were asked. How are you controlling for work experience?
So we have basically from their essay, we coded, how many years have you worked in, hold on, let me tell you what it is in the actual paper. We have,
Oh, watch out, I think you're squeezing the.
oh,
the-
sorry.
It's okay, Anisha's
I'll go
fixing
back.
it, you're all set.
All right. And so what we have here is, have you worked in a for-profit organization? And then I think that was just a yes, no, or is it
No.
years?
No, it's, so in their applications, they listed the industries they worked in.
Mhm.
And so we coded those industries as whether they fall into a nonprofit.
Or a for-profit. And then for education, we have degree in business.
Okay.
That was either undergraduate or graduate. And then for race, we had African American versus other.
Okay, so you have for-profit experience and business training.
Right. And those are highly, actually, the work in for-profit experience is not significant, but degree in business is highly significant. So these effects are all above and beyond that. Okay, so any other questions on those? Before we keep going? So what we see here in the first row, you'll see this is the female founder, and essentially you see that this that the effect on use of commercial practices is significant and negative, suggesting that in fact women founders of social ventures are less likely to use commercial practices in their ventures. Let me just show you what this looks like. So here along the y-axis you have each of the levels of commercialization that we coded for. So 1 is basically purely charitable, to 5, which is purely commercial, and that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have the probability of using each of these each of these levels. The blue bars are female founders, and the green bars are male founders. And so what you'll see is at every positive level of commercialization, so that's 2, 3, 4, and 5, women are significantly less likely to use commercial activities than male founders are. The second row now is the interaction effect that we were predicting. So you can see here that being a female founder in a community that has a greater proportion of female business owners actually mitigates this effect, and this coefficient is positive and significant, but let me show you what this looks like in a graph. This graph is actually true for all levels 2, 3, 4, and 5, but I just blew up 5 to see in particular because it's easy to see here. Along the x-axis now you have the proportion of female business owners in a local community. Along the y-axis you still have the probability of use of commercial practices. The red triangles are female founders, the blue circles are male founders. And so what you'll see is that as the proportion of female business owners in a community increases, the likelihood of using commercial practices if you're a female founder also increases.
Just one question, so these are female business owners in commercial contexts?
Yes, exactly. So they own what are essentially categorized as for-profit
So is
businesses.
this a network effect that they have?
Yeah.
Or is it a psychological?
This is a great question. So first of all, I think theoretically it does not have to be, right? So if you think about what could be happening, it doesn't necessarily presume that it has to be like a network or interaction thing, that because I'm there, I give you more. It could be that I'm giving you more access to resources, we're bonding on this shared characteristic of gender, even across these sectoral boundaries. That could totally be happening. It could also just be that because there is this presence of women business owners, that people in this local environment have a different mental model of what it means to engage in commercial activity, that in fact the sex typing in that local community of commercial activity could have been altered. We can't actually distinguish between those with our data, but I don't think it has to rely on interaction.
Yeah, because the DB is about them getting money from, the commercial activity here is getting money from other
How much they
organizations.
intend to. So these guys are, so we look at early stage social ventures. Actually, in the next sample, we'll show you how much money, like actual revenue. But here, this is my proposed use of commercial ventures. Does that?
Yeah.
I just think the network argument, I think, seems very
Plausible.
maybe you have other data to argue against that, but there are also the data in the venture community basically showing that women's capacity to raise funds in the venture community. I believe there's network data showing that women that it's actually
Yeah.
there's a gendered there's a gender homophily story about women's access to venture
Right.
capital.
Yep.
So that would be
It's
would be
consistent.
a kind of, that would be very consistent with the network
Yeah.
story.
I think my tendency is sort of to say,
Yeah.
is more to say we actually can't tell you what the underlying mechanism is. So it could be like just altering stereotypes. It could be actual interaction, and we, it'd be consistent with both of those.
Are they using any other type of strategies or behaviors if they're decreasing in commercial activity, right? So are they using any other type of activities in order
To
to
increase their
Yeah,
charitable
yeah.
revenue, that's an interesting question. We haven't actually examined that. What would you think of looking at?
Well, I guess if there's a higher proportion of like females in your network, and then that means you're less inclined to use the commercial type of behaviors, right?
Within your
Within
social
your
sector
social sector,
network.
yeah.
So we actually do have a little bit of, a little way of teasing that out in a second, which I'll get to. Yeah. So actually, maybe it's coming up on the next slide, in fact. So in summary, what we have here is that studies of commercialization of the social sector have really, not paid attention to the role of gender, and yet as a gendered person, it's sort of phenomenal to think that they haven't. And second, that we have this notion that the cultural beliefs about gender can result, even within social ventures in the social sector, in this less likelihood of using commercial practices. However, the presence of female business owners in the local community can mitigate this effect. That's just a summary. But what's interesting to think about, in terms of what Shira was asking, was, I'll go into this slide in a second, but we also thought about, well, is it just sort of a general female role modeling effect, right, that alters a whole set of stereotypes, not necessarily associated with commercial practices, for example. And so, or maybe even accentuated this use, as you were suggesting. And so we did a couple of things. We looked at women leaders in the House of Representatives, so political leaders, so sort of a general, I'm just gonna look at exactly how we phrased this in the paper, unless Stefan has it on the back of his hand.
Right, well, it was just whether, women
Female-
had been elected to the House of
To the
Representatives.
House of Reps, yeah. So female reps in in Congress, in the local community's congressional district, and the proportion of local nonprofit leaders that were women as interaction terms as well, and we actually don't see this effect. So we actually think it's fairly specific to this association between women engaging in commercial practices that's altering this behavior. And then in addition to that, we also did, to this issue of self-selection into the population of social ventures, we looked at course and exact matching. We also did a simulation, which is all in the paper, and I can go into offline if you're interested in that. But just to get a sense of how robust are these findings, and in fact, we find that they're pretty robust. But this was actually, because it's not a representative sample and we have these self-selection issues, we actually thought that it would be worth engaging in a constructive replication. So this is the second data set that we're going into now. And the point of a constructive replication is you essentially try to test the same underlying hypotheses, the same model, except with a different operationalization of the variables in a different sampler setting. And so here what we have is a second data set on nonprofit entrepreneurship. These new nonprofit organizations are quite similar to our social ventures in that they're recently founded, they're social sector organizations that are devoted to a social mission, and yet they face the same commercialization pressures, right? And in fact, what we have access to is the full population of newly founded nonprofit organizations. And so we don't have the same set of selection concerns. So what we have, over 29,000 nonprofit ventures founded during the years 2001, 2, and 3 from the Urban Institute database. Our dependent variable here to Michelle's question, the use of commercial activity, is actually taken from tax filings. So this is actual percentage of total revenue you get from providing some sort of service that people are paying you for. The independent variables here, we actually could go beyond just female founders to your question a little earlier about do we look more broadly than the founder. Here we actually look at female leaders of the organization. This is also on the same IRS form where we have the names of the top 5 ranking officers, and so we can look at whether it was the founder, CED, any of these were women.
So are you teasing out commercial activity outside of just fundraising? So for instance, lead generation is a huge part of business, an SME developing a pipeline, prospects and things like that. So are you you actually teasing out what constitutes commercial activity?
No, this is just overall percentage of what's reported in terms of earned revenue. That's it. So we don't break it down further into types of, or where it's coming from, or source of. I mean, that is definitely, Stefan knows this data a little bit more clearly. Is it possible, and would it be useful?
I mean, it's unfortunately not possible. I think it'd be really interesting to look at data like that, but unfortunately the way that the income is reported on the 990 forms for nonprofits, it's usually bundled under program services.
But your underlying question is, so would it be more possible, for example, if you were a female social venture founder, to raise money from X type of source rather than Y type of source or something like that? That you'd see even more fine-grained differentiation. Yeah.
And what constitutes commercial activity?
Yeah.
Is it sort of
Right, exactly.
gray
A
area?
good, yeah, for sure.
If you're a 5 on the scale and very commercially oriented, would you file as a nonprofit? Are there, there's other kinds of B Corps and things like that, so the
Yeah.
5s completely taking themselves off the table.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and Julie and Alnur and Johanna Meyer, right, the three of you on that paper actually make this very nice distinction between social sector organizations and their legal status. And so in this, if I recall correctly, in this we actually do control for their legal status. We don't control for their no, they're all within the 501. Sorry, they're all nonprofit organizations. Sorry, that's not what I meant. In the first data set, we actually don't have. They're very new. They haven't yet figured out where they are. But in this data set, they're all nonprofits. I think to your question, sorry, you want to jump in?
The first data set, some of them are very early, others have already incorporated. So we actually can, on the subsample, look into that, and we're controlling for legal status on that subsample for some of them. But it's a really small sample we're talking about. And in fact, I sort of feel I can answer this question because we sort of have different definitions of that sample, and I'm pretty confident that we see in the data the effect of gender we've been describing here is always there. To the point that, to tell you the truth, we sort of went to Lakshmi just because the results were consistently in front of us, sort of saying gender is critical there. So
I have to give Julie and Matt a lot of credit for this too, though, because they were like, because you're so used to in a lot of journal articles where it's a control variable. And they were like, no, there's something here, it's not just a control variable that's significant, there's a story. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there is a lot of, talk about that. But I think to your other point about, are they just taking themselves off the table? So I think Matt doesn't he have data coming from the other side? So I think Matt's actually investigating that question, right? Like organizations that start out on the commercial end of the spectrum on purpose. Or am I misremembering?
So he has data about sources of funding when they are a little bit more advanced, and they're likely to sort of attract different sources of funding.
Yeah. So this is super novel and about to happen, and he might have
and
something.
it's harder for hybrid organizations to raise funds.
So.
Should probably let you go on,
Yeah.
but just in differentiating your narratives, I wonder whether if you did an interaction between experience and percent of women. So you'd actually expect, if this was a story, if part of the story were your social influence story, then you'd actually expect the least experienced women to be the most influenced by women with business skills within the community, right? Whereas once you're controlling for experience,
then
I think you have a harder time differentiating this social and material arguments about why the network works.
That is really cool. That's really nice. I'd sort of given up on us being able to get to real mechanism with these data in a more fine-grained way, but that's a very
Might be just,
interesting
I don't know
way
whether
to
that,
look at it.
Yeah, if it even is significant. If it's not,
Interesting separation, yeah. So you have your own experience to fall back on, and so you're less likely to be
well, you'd just
susceptible
see
to
that,
the
you would see if it was a
alternate.
mentoring type of thing
Yeah.
that the women in the business community were doing, you would expect the effect to be greatest for women with the least amount of
That's
business
really
experience,
interesting.
right, or
Super
training.
cool.
But wouldn't that conflict a little bit with your network argument that would they be able to get those mentors if they didn't have the business experience?
Well, what do you mean?
So the previous point made about networks and homophily would imply that the women are using more commercial means in their social ventures, because they have more exposure to women in the business community, they have actual contact
Women
with
are more
them.
willing to give them money than men are. Like men are more inclined to invest in men.
In men, right.
Women
Okay,
may be more
invest, but
inclined.
not give
Women-
money,
women-
so not
Right.
donations, but to invest.
To invest,
Okay.
do business. I mean, that's the venture
Right.
analogy, right?
Okay.
So they're more likely to help them
Interesting.
commercialize.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a lot to think about. That's
Right.
helpful, thank you.
Or even if we could go down this train for a while, actually, I was just thinking of a bunch of different.
I was just wondering whether female and male leaders might have a different propensity in going from non-profit to profit.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a problem for your sample in the end. So say if the male leaders were switching more often, then the different non-profit ventures across male and female leaders would look very different.
Switching more often meaning within, so the same leader but across ventures, or am I misunderstanding?
The same leader and the male leader is more likely to go from from non-profit to profit.
Mm-hmm.
So then basically the sample of the non-profit ventures across male and female leaders would look very different.
It's like a revolving door argument, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like
they're more likely to go seek out.
Yeah,
That's where they want.
I agree with you that there is sort of, at least in our first sample, there are definitely sort of selection into the sample things, right? So you have, first of all, are you even willing to start one? Second of all, if you start one, are you likely to even apply to the fellowship? But here what we're looking at is within the entire population of nonprofit organizations. And so you might argue, okay, so men are gonna be less likely, if I follow your argument right, men are gonna be less likely to be represented in that population overall, right? They're not even coming into the nonprofit, the entire universe of nonprofits at the same rate that women are. So women are gonna be over likely to be in this sample. But then if we're still finding effects within that, I would imagine that that's sort of a more conservative version of looking at what you're saying. Do you see what I mean?
So also yes, so also what would be interesting is to see how the conversion rate from non-profit to profit looks like by gender maybe. If you can basically look at the age of the ventures, that might be another interesting outcome.
Part of what I want to say, I may be misunderstanding, but I think where you're going is sort of what are the consequences also of moving in a particular direction. So we don't necessarily have conversion rate, but we do have the survival of the ventures, which I'll get to in a second, if that helps a little bit, thinking about what the same train of thought, hopefully. Okay, so what do we have here? Independent variables, female leaders from the same tax form. The proportion of female business owners is the same data set except from the year 2002, which is closer to the year where these organizations are founded. And what we see, so again, this is a multi-level regression, and the first, what we see here is basically a replication of the main effect and the interaction that we saw previously. So the first line, being a nonprofit that's female-led actually has a negative effect on the percentage of revenue you get from commercial sources. And then second, if you're in a community that has a high proportion of female business owners, or as the proportion of female business owners in your community increases, this has a mitigating effect, such that you're more likely to have a greater percentage of commercial revenue. So we did have sort of a more exploratory question around whether this commercialization, so what we've shown you so far is essentially that there are these gender dynamics around the use of commercial practices in social venture organizations, and that there is this underlying locus of tension is around perhaps women engaging in masculine type activity even within the social sector, and the possible mitigating factors associated with women engaging in commercial activity in the commercial sector. But we also had this exploratory question around whether this commercialization of female-led social ventures actually affects, more than the fact that I do it, does this actually affect the organization itself? And so what we were able to do with these data was actually look at organizational survival. Essentially, our dependent variable, you can actually look at the tax filing we looked at the tax filings for 5 years out. So essentially 5 years out from this early stage venture, early stage organization, are you still reporting taxes? And what we're thinking there is, if you're not, this is evidence of some kind that you have failed, that you don't exist as an organization. So what we have, the dependent variable here, one is risk of failure. And so what you see is a hazard model predicting the risk of failure of nonprofit organizations in this population. And you have, the first line just looks at whether you're a female-led organization, right? And that is, doesn't really seem to have much of an effect. The second is looking at whether you're an organization that generates revenue from commercial practices, or the extent to which you generate your revenue from commercial practices. And that really doesn't seem to have much an effect on your risk of failure. But the interaction term is actually significant, such that being a female-led organization that is generating revenue from commercial sources actually increases the risk of failure 5 years out. So this actually leaves us with somewhat of a set of questions about what the implications for this are. That there are real organizational consequences to this choice by founders of whether to commercialize or not, especially if you're a female founder. One thing that we can't do, and I'd be interested to get your feedback on this, is we can't really differentiate whether this survival, so the increased risk of failure is because of greater backlash, which would be sort of my preferred explanation, or there are other sort of differences that are going on that result in this greater risk of failure. So maybe that's something to think about for our discussion. Oh yeah.
Can I just clarify, when you say greater risk of failure, do you mean as opposed to men engaging in the same activities, or just compared to?
It's the interaction, right? So it's not just female leaders versus male leaders. It's not just whether you're engaging in commercial revenue versus not. It's if you are a female-led social venture and you're engaging in greater commercialization, then you're less likely to, in our data set, it's basically you're less likely to show up in our data set as an existing viable organization.
Less likely than if you hadn't engaged in commercial.
Right. So that would be the second main effect. Right. So essentially, we think this paper is really interesting and makes contributions for a number of reasons.
Just one question. I know that you collected data on race. Given that, as I understand it, African American women are the fastest growing entrepreneurial segment, did you look at that at all in this study?
We do, and actually we don't talk about it in this paper, but the four of us started another collaboration around specifically looking at race, because you can also do this, not the same, but a similar sort of analysis, which would suggest that, to some extent, the racial dynamics in the social sector are pretty clearly demarcated, right? Beneficiaries are often, people of color. The grantee, leading or donating, giving organizations are often white. Like, there's a ton of underlying racial dynamics in this whole setup that sort of moved us in that direction too. Do you remember if there is an interaction with gender and race and what we did about that?
So I mean, the limiting factor for us was that the survey of business owners, the 2007 edition, did not publish what the statistics were for the racial minorities and women. So the intersection, those statistics are not published, strangely enough. So we couldn't really test our interaction for the subset of women who were African American or Hispanic or Asian or other races. And so we were really unable to kind of explore that. Maybe the 2012 edition, which has not yet been published, will include that, hopefully. So maybe we'll see soon.
Do you replicate the same interaction effect of like black organizational leader times percentage of business community?
Well, that's what Stefan's saying, that we actually don't have great data.
No, he's saying you don't have the interaction
of
effect.
women and race.
You don't have it at that level, but if you had it at the race level, have you replicated that?
We haven't.
No, we haven't looked into that
We haven't
direction,
looked
no,
into that.
because that race wasn't the focus of this paper.
Yeah.
That might help, again, with the network argument.
Say more? Because.
So if you had
Because you wouldn't
parallel-
have the gendered story, but you'd have the same network story, right?
Got it. Well,
So
And we're just talking
homophily,
about that
right?
later,
So
yeah.
if you're more likely to be supported by people like yourself.
But it wouldn't necessarily help distinguish between whether it's the change in the
African
stereotype.
Americans, if anything, are stereotype masculine.
Right.
Right?
Got
So,
it, I
you
see.
understand what I mean?
That's
So
where
you-
you're going.
you'd
I
be
see.
looking at a minority group that is actually stereotype masculine.
Got it.
And you would see whether
That's
your effect
interesting.
replicates. That would suggest a
That
demographic.
it's more about the.
That would suggest a number about, demographic proportions perhaps in homophily than
Than altering the-
stereotyped gender
Right.
frames.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So what do we think this paper, says or contributes to what we know about organizations and especially between the social and commercial sector? First, Julie and others have really called for attention to the antecedents of hybridity, so we keep documenting the fact that this increasing blurring occurs, so what drives it, beyond just these environmental factors. There's really the role of individual founders in this, and the role of gender, we think, is a very novel introduction to that literature. In terms of local communities and gender, I actually see this as an opportunity for the gender literature and organizations in particular, because we think of communities, we're introducing communities here as a really important social relational context in which gendered cultural beliefs are being activated. And if you think about sort of the studies that Shelley Carell or Cecilia Ridgway have done, like community is just sort of an absent kind of thing, and so this would be a very interesting sort of level at which to think about the influence of communities on gender dynamics and organizations. We also clearly contribute to gendered aspects of entrepreneurship. Much of the work we know looks at differences in founding rates, in performance, discrimination. But here what we're doing is saying gendered cultural beliefs actually inform your choice of how to organize, right? What is the kind of organizing activity you engage in? And that this kind of entrepreneurship actually becomes a mechanism for transmitting cultural beliefs into new organizations, into newly founded organizations. And last, if you think about this blurring of the boundaries, what I found super interesting about this, and I set this up a little bit at the beginning, that much of the work, at least in gender and organizations that I'm familiar with living in the business school, often looks at women who are disadvantaged in male tasks in male-dominated settings. And so here what we have is a very interesting situation of women engaging in masculine-typed activity in a feminine-typed setting. And I think it's super cool to think about what's the joint examination of women perhaps disrupting gender norms in one sector, such as the female business owners in the commercial sector, and their relationship to women disrupting gender norms in the social sector, such as our female venture founders. I mean, this cross-sectoral gender connection is a super interesting one to think about. Pioneers in one place influencing pioneers in another, or something like that, being very colloquial here. But and then to your earlier question about the meaning of commercial activity, I think this is a super provocative question to really think about, because you can choose to see this in completely different ways, right? So on the one hand, is commercialization actually a process of masculinizing the social sector? And are men founders perhaps like one example of the carriers of this kind of logic? And are women who don't commercialize in the social sector being held back by occupational stereotypes of what's male-typed and proper activity for women? Or are they actually defenders of feminine-typed work that should be predominant in a feminine-typed setting? You can really choose to have some interesting debates about this, I think. So with that, I'll leave it, and if you have any more questions or concerns, I'd love to hear them.
I have a question about, I was really interested in what you said about the check about the political level, and I wondered, this might just be my ignorance of the CBSA, how it mapped in terms of, so you're looking at representatives in the House,
Yeah.
how that mapped onto the communities, and kind of not.
That's a great question.
I
So
don't
do
know what the level
congressional
is.
districts map onto CBSAs, and if so, what are the, that is a very good question. I don't know the answers to that.
And more I don't know,
Yeah.
it's more macro than that, and more local level that might have more impact.
The mapping was definitely not clean, and there's no standardized process for doing it. So it was pretty much we just approximated it based on where the voters were located, which voters were eligible.
Much bigger. I'm not sure how big your communities are. I just haven't really
CBSAs are pretty big. So in that sense, it wasn't like it was including a lot of people who weren't in the CBSA already. So in that sense, it was more along the lines of maybe a couple of congressional districts being represented by one CBSA.
Okay.
But in that case, then both of those were counted. in the measure.
Okay, thank you.
Have you thought about connecting this at all to the organizational research by the other Shelley, who's now at some of the research on organizational culture?
You mean Shelley Brixton?
Shelley Brixton's
Oh, wow.
work.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, on because I think that's what you're arguing, right? Is that actually the organizations are adopting a feminized culture,
Interesting.
and I wonder if there's a connection to some of the other organizational scholars who've looked at how variation in organizational culture affects organizational practices. I don't remember what Shelley predicts anymore
Yeah.
with that work, but I know she looked pretty deeply at kind of like collectivist
She did
type
individualistic, collectivistic, and relational.
yeah,
or
which
that's her
which actually
typology.
fits pretty well with your
Yeah, that's
masculine,
interesting.
feminine, but I don't remember what her DBs were. But
That is
she looked pretty
fascinating.
deeply, I think, at how.
And she has not really talked about it from a gender perspective. Like she calls them individualistic, collectivistic, and relational, but
Mhm.
there's not really an underlying piece around gender. But what it makes me think of is actually Mandy O'Neill has some interesting work on organizational cultures, on masculine organizational cultures, and so that might be a place to hook in. That's more
see
that's
what
closer.
they predict,
Yeah.
and that would
Yeah.
sort of fit with what you guys are finding.
So I guess if you were speaking to a group of female founders of nonprofits who are thinking about moving to like commercialize more of their programs or revenue streams or whatever, what would be your advice?
It's a great question, and Julie and I have talked about this a little bit because she's actually been doing interviews with these female founders, and actually she should.
It's a complicated question because I don't want us to assume that, if you're about to address a social problem, the thing you should do is create a social enterprise and generate commercial revenue. So I'm just, just want to be clear about that and saying it depends on what you're up to and so now, what I do see in the work I'm doing with people who create what I call those hybrid organizations that generate some revenues is that the women I interview talk about the struggles they face without me priming them in any way. So it's actually very interesting that I would very often sort of report to Stefan, Lakshmi, and Matt conversations, and I know the same from Matt, in which you have founders of hybrid organization, female founders who would say things like, it's unbelievable, I'm attending this event and I'm pitching, and this guy next to me is pitching too, and I have to face questions such as, why are you doing it in such a way? You could have a more traditional model, and they would report that they feel frustrated because these questions are not asked to the men around them who they say have the exact same model. No, I'm not in the room, so I don't know the extent to which they have the exact same model, and again, it's not a normative approach, this is what they should do, but that is at least what they report. So this frustration exists and comes out of interviews without asking them questions about gender differences.
Question, I was wondering, so I'm actually co-founder of NGO that does commercial ventures, so this is resonating with me in a different context because it's in Southeast Asia, a small country, so different from how things work here. But I was wondering if one of the issues that you face is that maybe in the social sector, women have more room to. This is a very it's a generalization, but to be mothers, to have more time, to follow more of the typical stereotypical woman role than what they would find in the commercial sector. Because what I think, and obviously this is not saying that in the social sector you don't work extremely hard, which you do, but maybe because the environment is more protective, because as you said, it's more, the focus is more caring, is more selfless, then maybe women find it easier, or the environment makes it easier than what it would be in the commercial sector.
So I think that's very consistent with our understanding of what, female typed work, is why it's supposed to be sort of the cultural model or ideal or attractive. But I think if I'm understanding correctly, you're suggesting that this that this is, it's more in line with the, therefore you would expect perhaps female social venture founders to be more inclined to identify with and defend the charity model, that kind of explanation, than the kind of explanation that's in line with I'm trying to do it and I'm getting all the, you know, the backlash that I'm not supposed to, right? Like both, because I think both of these could be going on simultaneously, and yeah, so does that? I mean, oh, sorry.
Sorry. I'm not sure if there have been studies on this conducted before your paper came out, but what do you think the effect will be if you transplanted the same sort of study onto a different geography, where social pressures on women are amplified? Say, for example, in communities like India, I'm not very familiar with Africa, but I would assume they are the same. Because there are examples in India of women-led social organizations which take care of childcare, which create local farms. I mean, they're not revenue-based, revenue-driven models, but they have been breaking the social norm, so to say. Do you think the results will be completely different? I mean, what do you expect those sort of effects to look like?
So would you expect to see, for example, female founders in a place like India engage in are less likely to engage in commercial practices?
Yes.
I mean, I think this is a super interesting question in any sort of other, maybe more developing economy context. And I have not talked about this with Stefan and Julie, so I'd be totally interested to see what they say. But having worked in development for many years, and sort of you see what, you know, what's interesting actually in like some of the gender, and there are more people who know more about this in this room than I do, but what you see, I think, in the gender literature in development in particular, is that women basically own the informal economy and small scale trading, my little basket weaving shop, my market selling techniques or whatever. And then still when you get to like formal enterprises, it becomes more and more masculine, right? And so even when you say that women engaging in commercial practices because they're used to doing it in the markets and they're used to doing it in this and they're used to doing it that and there are no penalties for that, I still think by the time you get to starting a formal organization and engaging in commercial activity, there's likely to be some underlying gender dynamic around that. That would be my guess, just based on that literature. But
I agree, and I think the general colloquial observation would be that women who are in leadership positions tend to be more masculine in general, and I think that comes from the expectation that if you don't behave like a man, you should get ahead.
I mean, yeah, that's like a much bigger issue, or related but much bigger issue than we can deal with this problem. Okay.
Thinking about the way the conversation's been shaking out and the question which took place about sort of geography and looking at the elected officials, an interesting overlay might be not just looking at congressional representation, but if one is thinking, for example, about the informal economy where women in some regions have really dominated, when you get to the more formal economy with greater returns, men have continued to dominate. Sort of the parallel for that is if you look within this country at state legislatures, state legislatures where, and state legislatures, every state defines for itself in essence what are the gains associated with serving in those roles. And on the whole, this has begun to change a bit, but on the whole, legislatures that are more formal, that meet year round and have high pay and high status, have many, many, many more men. And legislatures that are low pay, are considered part-time, have lower status, tend to be more female. But that might be a really nice
proxy for this kind of
for that kind of piece, and for getting a sense of where how women are faring in the community. And I bet you'll see sort of some interplay with what are the business networks like, you know, how far have women risen in the community. Interesting. And the other piece which keeps running through my mind is who chooses to apply for these fellowships. And that I keep sort of wondering, is it just in some way a more masculine task to go and apply for a competitive entity from the get-go?
Right.
And which still tells us something important.
Yeah.
But it makes me keep wondering what isn't getting captured in that, and is there something interesting up there as well?
So that, I think, is definitely a limitation of our sample. But we did try to address that. I mean, so there's this, and Stefan probably is the one who should answer or talk about this a bit more, but we did do a course in exact matching, which looks at this, like sort of looking at sex imbalances in the sample that we end up getting. And these simulations where we sort of, you can run sort of if there were X number of women in this community versus that and this, so if, do you wanna say more about what we did to address some of the self-selections?
Yeah, I think, the course in the exact matching was kind of helpful to look into that, where we tried to match every woman. So first of all, the sample was almost perfectly balanced. There were 50% women, 50% men. Of course, that doesn't address the issue you brought up, so we tried to match them based on how similar they looked to each other. And the results were unchanged. They were exactly the same. So that kind of gave us a bit more faith in what was going on. But of course, it's not enough, so which is why we conducted the constructive replication, where you don't have the same selection issues.
I also did have at one point, Hannah knows this a little bit, but I do also conduct experiments, and so there was, like, we were going through variations of, is there an experimental way to get at this? And let me tell you, trying to induce community, I know why people like Cecilia or Shelley don't do community level effects, because trying to induce community in a laboratory is completely kind of crazy making. So, I think there's, so we tried to explore other avenues to make sure that we could say that these results were robust, but I think we're feeling pretty confident about that.
Absolutely, really interesting.
Sorry, I had a thought, but let other people.
Yeah. Have you looked at any of the bigger and more visible not-for-profits, So for example, how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation works in terms of gendering? Because they have, that question of, what are their gendered roles, right, in this? And what kind of path do they lead you down in terms of commercialization?
That's an interesting question. We have not looked at it, but what you're saying makes me think of, sort of, if we went back to the earlier question about the sources of, and what you'd expect probably to see if we could break it down, would be even within sort of choosing charity, like, even when, like, for example, some sort of interrelationship between if a lot of your funding is coming from something like the Gates, which, for example, I happen to know, like, many of these large organizations, grant-making organizations often now ask you to include commercial sources or some sort of revenue generation kind of model, or sets of, ideas anyway, when they're giving you the grant money. And so, you could almost imagine that there's sort of this weird push towards more commercialization from grant-making sources. That would be an interesting thing to consider, but this is our first stab at what's happening.
I have a question regarding the channels who reach these low profits, like do the women end up in kind of generating less revenues in non-profit sector? And one of the assumptions I would have probably that in the literature we often see that women self-select into the low profit sectors, like services sector, in developing countries, etc. Would be the case here if non-profits which are owned by women operate maybe, let's say, in the arts and culture, it probably would be less revenue generating than healthcare sector. So did you think about that?
We control for area of social action even in the second sample too. Yeah. So these effects are controlling for what area you choose to be in. So if that effect was there, and we haven't looked at an interaction though in particular.
We did look at interactions, and there wasn't anything really there. There weren't any consistent differences between the different areas of social action. Because we looked at those a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Because we were hoping to go down that path and investigate something along those lines, but it didn't work out.
And the second question related to the first results you showed and the control variables. Like in developing countries, very often women go into entrepreneurship or in politics if they have a strong role model, like a father who's engaged into politics and has own business, etc. So I was wondering if you look at that, for example, if a woman is married to a man who has his own business, she might kind of get affected by his way of thinking, his way of thinking, which also engage more in the commercial activity.
Don't you guys have another? I'm going to let her answer this one. No.
We have another paper in which we're looking at the influence of parents' professional trajectories on the social venture founders like you to create a hybrid versus a typical not-for-profit. We do find that having parents who sort of themselves, either from one parent or both of them bring some kind of a hybrid experience to the table that would make individuals more likely to create a hybrid. What we're doing just now, in fact, I just talked to Matt 2 days ago, is that we're going to look more into
into the gender dynamics on this dimension as well. Like that other paper was a paper in which we were just controlling for gender, and we came to the conclusion that it could very well be that the gender dynamics are very important at that stage as well. So we may well be writing a second gender.
So next year, you and Matt are gonna be giving the gender talk.
But this is a very important point. Yeah, thank you.
In a way, conceptually, it sounds like where the conversation is going is that there's an enriched environment that may include representation. It may include just the whole political, context. It also may include family role models. It may include, all these other factors. So, in the spirit of intersectionality, it sounds like thinking in terms of that layered complexity may be a way to kind of build a larger frame around this.
Yeah, no, that's a very beautiful thought that, I kind of resonate with, that if you could put all the pieces together, and I do think this, maybe this is, it's like what you put in a single paper versus what you elicit from the whole, right? And I think you're absolutely right. It's a very nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah, just picking up on that point, I recently read this book on women's pathways into politics in developing countries, and it was saying that a common pathway was women working in healthcare or education. So they got a profile in their local community, doing some good. So this third point about disrupting norms, it's really interesting to think about when you see women more in business, what impact that will have in their political participation. If that social sector is the only way to become known in their community.
And then it, right.
So you said, I'm reminding you may have already said this, that there was a question that when you were coding the text data, whether or not the person had exposure to business. Was that what you said?
Experience in the for-profit
Okay.
sector and education, like business degree as an
And
education.
those were like yes, no questions.
So I think one is yes, no, and the other is years, you said, or you said something else.
Well, we have their education, so what degrees they have, so whether they had graduate education in business, whether they did their undergrad in some business or economics kind of type field. So that was the educational component. And then the work component had to do with their work experience. So we knew the latest company they worked for as well as the industry they worked in.
Okay.
And that was pretty explicit, accounting, well, these are for-profit ones.
So the reason I was asking was, I think that research suggests that men and women are both developing social capital as they move through their careers, but men are developing wider, maybe more sparsely connected networks because they hop in and out of sectors all the time, whereas women tend to be developing more dense, narrow sets of social capital. And I'm thinking that could influence the extent to which a man or woman would choose to commercialize, in the sense that if you have this sparse, wide network, you're getting varieties of types of information that's influencing the choices you're going to make as you go down the road. Whereas if you're in this more narrow, dense network, your view of information is much more narrow. So I guess I was just thinking if you had a measure of how varied their careers were, whether that would influence the extent to which they chose to commercialize.
Yeah, so not just do you have exposure or not, but variability or something.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have that or not, but
Yeah, just building on that. Like one of the things I was struck is just knowing Julie as a sociologist and not knowing a lot about institutional theory, but I know they talk a lot about kind of novel forms versus more established forms, and I found it kind of interesting that the proportion of the sample that was out 5 on commercialization is actually the minority of your sample, whereas the predominant form was this more nonprofit
Still the nonprofit.
model.
Yeah.
So, you have this, you have the riskier, right, less well institutionalized form, where you're finding the gender variation, and it could be this sort of network. It could be this, experiment. It could be the strength of weak ties type of thing,
right.
Or it could also be that you have this not very well institutionalized form, and that's masculine stereotypes, and therefore when somebody arrives, I'm less skeptical about the novel form when it arrives in a masculine bundle than in a feminine bundle, because that would even more defy the sort of institutionalized norm, for your backlash.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the network effect you're describing, it's it's an intriguing question we cannot tell you this data, but
Yeah,
I'm thinking about the
I
fellowship
might
we're
not be
running
able to.
here.
Yeah.
In fact, I collected them for data, for a case study I did with them this past weekend, and I was thinking that's be interesting to track that over time, to see the extent to which we see the dynamics you're predicting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what is your
Really good. Well, I think we're almost at the end. Can I ask one last question to take advantage? Do you have any qualitative data on whether, to this question earlier about, why commercial ventures would disappear more often when they're female than male run? Do you have any data on the time intensity of running a commercial as opposed to non-commercial venture?
So we don't, I mean, that's an interesting question, and the qualitative part is something we've been wondering about. Like, we do have some qualitative data, but they wouldn't enable us to answer this question. Matt, in his dissertation work, looked into how difficult it is to raise funds, depending on whether you're sort of, the typical not-for-profit versus the hybrid. And as you would expect, it is definitely much more difficult, in fact, if you're a hybrid. So you could be thinking it's also much more time-consuming.
Yeah.
And he's finding an interesting moderation that though there are situations in which there is a better alignment between the social and commercial activities, and then in those situations, then there are more synergies, so it becomes easier to do it, and you do not face the same kind of obstacles, which may also have to do with time, the fact that it's an easier message and the framing works better, and then you can more easily raise the funds.
I mean, cause I could imagine, like, if you're just like if you're just like connected to a government hose, right? I mean, where you're just like, you're commercial, but all you basically get is government contracts, right? That are fairly, it's a rich, resource-rich environment with maybe government work norms. That's a very different thing than being more like a commercial venture. It's just interesting, I serve on the board of a nonprofit that's totally fee-based. And because they don't charge a lot of money, they work so hard. I mean, they don't demand the same margins as a commercial venture relative to the amount of labor that they're doing. And so it ends up being a very time-intensive operation to remain profitable and nonprofit at the same time. So I would think that it's not, I wouldn't think like commercialization itself, but it would vary maybe depending on whether the type
it
of
goes back to the
commercialization.
earlier question
What's
about
the
the
commercial
sources.
activity and what are our resources, and should we create typology there?
Yeah.
This is a very good point.
I think,
I can actually maybe share something that happened with us in doing that shift from typically not-for-profit and then starting social venture, commercial ventures. One of the difficulties was that we were doing commercial activities with a social impact. So you're not only doing commercial activities, which already entails a lot of different mindsets and work that you didn't have to do if you were just operating as a non-profit, but also you have to justify your social impact. So it requires that extra work. Plus, in a number of times we are getting funding to do that type of work. So we have to not only do the work that you would do as a normal commercial venture, but then you have to report as you would in a not-for-profit style. So that just simply triples the work.
Exactly.
Which makes it very challenging and much more time-consuming.
Right.
I mean, a lot, and also the skills it requires change a lot from who's leading the projects, and so that was a very complicated shift.
Right. So can I just ask a little bit more kind of in that vein though? So that's sort of the general tension, right? But then is there a specific underlying gender dimension that you experience to that tension, I guess would be the...
I can tell you from an organizational point of view and from a community point of view, which is, from a gender point of view, I would say that most of the people, and that links with the gender roles someone was asking before, within our organization, for instance, mainly, so men are typically doing more of the commercial side of things, and women are typically doing more of the finance and fundraising. So that was interesting because you had that impact. From a community point of view, because a lot of the work that we do is community based, and so a lot of the work that we developed was to help communities start ventures. We also saw that there was an issue with, and saying before that, you know, at the low level, you would have much more interaction from women, but then when you went to a formal setting, it was much more complicated. We've seen that too, and one of the reasons was actually regarding the fact that women would have to go more out of the house. So at the lower level, you could still very much operate within, you know, close to your kids or close to your day-to-day house chores. But then once you formalized, and even if you were operating the house, but you know, you had to go to more meetings, you had to network with more people, and you had to be away more, then women would find it much more troubling to keep that going. Often they would then, one of the ways that we've been trying to one of the options for them was to send that role to their husbands. One of the ways we're trying to fight it is to try to involve their daughters. So trying to see if we can train their daughters because they needed to have, I mean, they couldn't get out of the house, so who would they send? So that's one of the things that we're doing is to try to involve their daughters and nieces.
So interesting. That is a fascinating example. Well, wonderful.
Thank
Please
you
join
all
me in
so
Lakshmi Ramarajan. Please join us next week on September 29th. Catherine Zippel, who's an associate professor of sociology at Northeastern, is going to be talking about paradoxes and transformations in higher education. So comparing European and U.S. perspectives.